The reality is that climate is changing and it affects every single one of us.
We've heard the warnings. We've seen the extreme weather even here at home.
We are facing an atmospheric flooding event. We have issued an evacuation alert on all reserves.
But are the impacts of climate change affecting everyone equally? The richest 10% account for more than half the carbon emissions in the world. But it's the poorest whose lives are ruined after inadequate housing is washed away in floods, farmlands destroyed by droughts, which leaves many displaced from their homes.
Over 2 million of my fellow Kenyans are facing climate-related starvation. Please open your hearts. There have been deadly heat waves and wildfires in Algeria and devastating floods in Uganda and Nigeria. And there is more still to come.
Will the world open their hearts? And will the church be at the forefront of climate justice? Today on Context, climate change and poverty. Welcome to Context. I'm Maggie John. So what is the link between poverty and climate change? Oxfam International has addressed the inequities of poverty head on for years. And while it's a tough task, they're not alone. Other organizations like Visible Impact have found a disturbing link between the increase in child marriage and climate change. Ian Thompson is the policy manager at Oxfam Canada, and Medha Sharma is the president of Visible Impact. Thank you both for joining me today. Ian, I want to start with you. How is climate change unfairly impacting the poor and those living in the global south?
We know that the climate crisis is affecting everybody in the world, but the impacts are felt so differently. And we see that income level is one of the biggest determinants in who's being hit hardest by the climate crisis. So people living in low income or lower middle income countries really bear the brunt of the extreme weather events. They're 5 times more likely to be displaced due to extreme weather compared to those living in high income countries. And even within those societies, we do see that women and girls are often particularly disadvantaged. During droughts, they will have to travel further and spend more time gathering water or collecting food for the family. Farming becomes much more challenging, and they are often the leaders in the subsistence farming in their communities. So we just see time and time again, those who've contributed the least to the climate crisis are really facing the worst impacts.
Ian, we're going to hear from Medha in a couple of seconds about the correlation between child brides and climate change. But have you seen correlations between ways that climate change is impacting the global south that you had never seen before?
Well, I do think that climate change is really changing the way many local economies work in developing countries. We see as resources get more scarce, increases in conflict. And I think many of us in Canada don't fully appreciate how much resource scarcity can drive conflict and even lead to spikes in things like gender-based violence as people are displaced from their homes and have to move into refugee camps. Those sort of unintended, unforeseen consequences of climate change that impact women and girls specifically are surprising to many Canadians when they hear about those impacts.
Medha, you are based in Nepal. While child marriages are illegal, the devastating impacts of climate change are putting girls at risk for child marriage. Tell us about that correlation.
For many of us, climate change is about getting hotter summers. Like we might be thinking we need to get air conditioners in our room. But for many women and girls, it's about having lesser food on your plate. The climate change induced food insecurity is now impacting girls to the extent of child marriage. Take a country like Nepal or Bangladesh for an example, where there's already a problem of child marriage and are prone to climate change. Now, in the hope of food security for their daughters, parents are getting their daughters married off early. And even in her new in-law's house, she's expected to bear children, as many children as possible and as soon as possible, even if she's just an adolescent, in the hope that there will be more hands to serve in the field and we can get ahead of this food insecurity.
So the daughter's parents cannot afford to feed her or the family because of climate change, because they're not reaping in enough of a harvest. So they have to then sell their daughters into marriage in order to survive. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Okay, and has this set back the progress made by organizations like Visible Impact and governments to end child marriages?
Well, the thing is, child marriage looks so abstract to so many people. Like if after 100 years, there's not going to be a polar bear in the North Pole, then what it has to go to with me today, right? And that's where the connection is missing. And these conversations have just started to come up. We don't still have very strong evidences that's shown or published, but we know from the fields, like from our experiences, how this has been changing and shaping the lives of women and girls. So as such, the Visible Impact, for example, has been engaging with girls and women and giving them this perspective, and also trying to create a safety net for them in the community, where they can feel safe with each other and be the social champions. However, this conversation is majorly lacking, not only in developing or developed countries, but like globally. This is a conversation that needs much more depth than what's currently happening.
Yeah, it needs to happen at a grassroots level. Ian, what can we do as individuals to make a difference when it comes to tackling the inequalities of climate change?
Well, there's many things that we can do as Canadians. I mean, first off, we are one of the highest emitting countries per capita when it comes to carbon emissions. So obviously we have to take responsibility for our contribution to the problem and really have to be more ambitious and with greater urgency, cutting back our own emissions. The other thing that we can do, and the Canadian government has been doing, is actually providing financing to people in the global south to tackle the climate crisis in their own setting. We were pleased to see Canada double its climate finance last year, but we really want to see that funding flow to communities quickly. It's such an urgent problem, and we haven't seen that new package actually flow to those who in need. So getting climate finance to reach particularly women's rights organizations and grassroots organizations would be our priority, and we're working with the government to make that happen.
Medha, I'm going to leave the last word to you. What are other ways that we here in Canada can help, especially climate change's impact on girls in Nepal?
So I'd like to say, these girls and women are perhaps the one who has contributed the least to the climate change, but they are the ones who have been suffering, and there's a huge gap. So we just need more rights-based perspectives for them. Women and girls, they have been adapting. They know how to adapt. They know how to mitigate climate changes more than anyone else. So we just need to recognize their resilience and bring this agenda to a much bigger level of discussions, like Canada, for example, can really advocate for this issue in the global arena as well. And then we need to capacitate the girls and women at the grounds so that they can recognize this link and they can prepare themselves. They can be the change in the society.
So well said. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks, Maggie.
Thank you. Thank you.
A look at Canada now, where flooding in British Columbia late last year devastated parts of the province, wiping out farms, roads, and homes, forcing 15,000 people to evacuate. This comes as parts of the province are still recovering from wildfires and record-breaking heat waves last summer. And that's just one province. Jason Thistlethwaite is an environmental risk assessment expert and joins us now. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We're seeing the effects of climate change across Canada, flooding on both coasts, wildfires in BC and Alberta. Has Canada done enough to adapt to climate change risks?
No, the country hasn't done enough. As you've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, climate change is happening, the risk is increasing. And we as a country haven't done a good enough job. Our governments haven't done a good enough job protecting those who are going to be affected by it most.
What can Canadians expect for the future of climate change risks? Will flooding, wildfires, and even drought become more common?
Certainly, you're going to see, flooding is Canada's most costly and common hazard. That's going to be our most significant climate risk. Wildfire is also a substantial risk, particularly out west in places like British Columbia, Alberta, but certainly the boreal forests in Ontario are a concern. Urban flooding in particular is going to increase quite considerably. This is the water that ends up in your basement after a significant downpour. Most notably, what you're going to find is it's going to start to take an impact on your pocketbook. Canadians already pay out for flooding alone close to $700 million a year in damages. So these are not small numbers, and I would only anticipate that those costs and those disruptions on your everyday life are likely to increase.
When you say that the government isn't doing enough, in your estimation, what does the government need to do, as this is literally at our doorsteps, pounding down the door, as we're seeing what's happened in BC and Alberta and, of course, on the East Coast?
Right. So there's a few things they can do. The first would be to help us understand where the risk is. We don't have very good publicly available maps in Canada showing us things like where flood risk is. The second thing that we can do is invest heavily in local risk mitigation. And then finally, lastly, we need to really fix our, what we call sort of the governance complexity in Canada, right? We have many governments with overlapping, redundant, and fragmented services.
In a report you co-authored, you looked at the flood risks to Indigenous communities with a social vulnerability index. Why is it important to look at climate risk through a socioeconomic lens?
Yeah, this is a great question. So historically in Canada, the way that we went about managing and understanding risk is we use two things. We want to know where the hazard goes. So where the water, where the wildfire goes, right? And that gives you a sense of whether or not there's exposure. So you have people and property and infrastructure in the way. That, generally speaking, gives you an incomplete measurement of the risk without that socioeconomic vulnerability. We also need to know whether or not a community is going to be able to absorb and recover from that risk. If you're just using things like where the floodwater goes and where property is getting hit by that water, generally speaking, you're going to have a lot of resources that are prioritized to areas that are already well-resourced. Cities, downtowns, where people, can have resources to be able to absorb a bit of that risk. What the socioeconomic vulnerability analysis does is it lets us know, well, where are these communities that actually really need these resources? Where are the communities that when an event happens, you have people that are knocked out of the workforce, you have people that need to declare bankruptcy, or people that need to refinance their mortgage. These are the big hits on the economy that over the long term that we're going to have to do a better job taking care of. So vulnerability gives an additional layer of information, and it just helps us prioritize where resources really should be going in Canada to help us manage climate change risk.
All right, Professor Jason Thistlethwaite, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Coming up, can the church be a leader in the action around climate change? One group thinks it can. That's next.
The heartbreak and the injustice is hard to bear. Sub-Saharan Africans are responsible for just 0.5% of historical emissions. The children are responsible for none, but they are bearing the brunt. We are the adults on this earth right now, and it is our responsibility to ensure that the children have food and water.
My next guest is part of an organization that is committed to equipping Christians to care for creation and work toward a stable climate and a healthy, pollution-free world. Is that possible? Jessica Mormon is the vice president of the Evangelical Environmental Network. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
So is that possible at this point? Can we have a pollution-free world, and can Christians be at the forefront of that movement?
Well, I'd say absolutely. As Christians, we believe that God can do the impossible. And when we partner with him, Jesus in John 10:10, it says that he comes to bring abundant life for all. And part of that is having a healthy environment where everyone can thrive. And so this addressing climate change, addressing the harms of pollution in the 21st century, it has to be a part of the equation when it comes to our Christian witness and our Christian mission. And that's what we seek to do at the Evangelical Environmental Network, helping come alongside Christians and living out this calling that God has given us to be good stewards of all that he's made.
Is it as hard as some might make it seem in getting Christians to understand the effects of climate change?
Well, I think what's really key is bringing messengers to Christians who can speak their language. And that's what we do at the Evangelical Environmental Network, showing that there are Christian climate scientists like myself, like Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who see our work in science as part of our Christian calling. I know that I'm a climate scientist because of my faith in Christ, not in spite of it. And so what we've seen over the discourse around climate is that there haven't been a lot of Christian messengers there, but now we're seeing this changing. Not only do you have to be a climate scientist to have authority to speak on this, actually what we're seeing is that friends and family have a big impact on helping others, those in our church, discover our call to be climate stewards. And so that's, again, what we're trying to do, of help others lift their voice, those within the church lift their voice to let others in their community know that this is an important discipleship issue and an important kingdom mission issue.
One of your teammates in your organization was quoted saying, "Earth care equals people care." The impact of climate change on marginalized communities is quite significant. How can the church help in caring for this segment of the population when it comes to creation care?
I think one of the things the church can do is to do what it does best, which is to serve people. I know in just this past summer in British Columbia alone, nearly 600 people died from an extreme heat wave. And a lot of that was folks who died in their own homes because they lacked access to air conditioning, to cooling centers. What if the church was involved in making sure that vulnerable community members, the marginalized in our communities, were taken care of and looked after during extreme weather events like this? This is one way that the church can get involved. Another way is to simply make sure that when big decisions are made, that marginalized voices are lifted up in that decision making.
Your organization states good economic stewardship has a significant overlap with good environmental stewardship. What does that look like?
Yeah, it looks like in two ways: in our households and our churches, switching to doing energy efficient practices, making sure that we're saving energy. That helps save money. And especially when it comes to a church budget, over 30% of energy costs are wasted. That's wasted energy. If we could recover 30% of that money that's going to the utility company, just imagine what you can do for your missions. You can do that in your own household too. And so we're also seeing, not only with energy efficiency, but also clean energy has become the cheapest form of energy production. And so what we see is, as we get more energy efficient, as we switch to cleaner sources of energy, that's also good, a good stewardship of our resources too.
Yeah, practical ways of making a change when it comes to our climate. Jessica Moorman of the Evangelical Environmental Network, thank you for your time today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
The Q panel is back. Jackie, Brian, and Moira weigh in on climate change and what they feel the church's role should be in this ever-increasing global emergency. Next.
We speak peace into the storm, but we don't use weather maps. We are media missionaries.
The Q panel is back for our spring season. Today we're discussing climate change and poverty. Jackie, Brian, and Moira are with us. Jackie, I'm going to start with you. Does the church take climate change seriously?
I think it depends on who you ask. And
I'm asking you, Jackie.
Thanks, Maggie. Honestly, I would say the church does not take climate change as seriously as they should. This is such a pressing global issue right now that will impact generations to come. We see how it's already impacting us. And we know that climate change inadvertently, like so many issues in the world, impacts the most vulnerable. And if as Christians we're to care about the most vulnerable people, then we really need to prioritize what we're doing, what we're thinking about, what we're praying about when it comes to climate change, and putting advocacy out there as Christians, because we know that, we might be comfortable in our homes in North America or wherever we are, but for 20 million refugees and people every single year who are displaced as a result of climate change, that reality is completely different for them. And so if we are meant to care for everyone around the world, then this really should be much more of a top concern than it is right now.
Brian, your thoughts on this?
One of the things that I think you have to ask yourselves is, what is the unique contribution that the church can make on these discussions? I think if we're talking purely in terms of advocacy, I think that's important. Don't get me wrong, I'm not sure that the church should be quietist. But I think so. What can the church contribute that other organizations cannot? And one of the things that I think it contributes, and this has been recognized by people like eco-modernists and others as well, is that one has to ask, why should we even care at all? And I think Christians are uniquely equipped to speak about loving creation, to actually loving the material world as something that God has made, and actually providing the deep spiritual roots that can sustain these longer term political projects that are necessarily going to be subject to the hurly-burly of politics and different positions that they're actually people can disagree on normally. But what the church can contribute is the fact that we as human beings are responsible for caring for a world that is worthy of love, that little newt that's in your neighborhood or that beautiful tree is actually something that you should be loving and that you should be concerned about and you should have care for. And that's often missing, I think, in secular folks who are concerned about climate change. It tends to be very technical. And I think that's often why people get exhausted with it. So I think that's one area where the church could focus and probably should.
Yeah, it seems like such an overwhelming topic. And it's like, okay, how does this apply to my life? How do I do this well, right? I agree with you. It can seem overwhelming. Moira, Pope Francis has been very outspoken when addressing climate change and sustainable living. Why is he seemingly to be the only prominent faith leader doing so?
Yeah, it's a great question considering all the discussions there have been about climate change politically, et cetera, over the years. I think it maybe links a little bit with Brian's concept, our Christian approach to the earth and all that is in it as a gift from God. And I think it has taken us a long time to maybe come back to seeing that the roots for any kind of climate change have to come from us, not just politically and socially, but also there's a deeper sense of this climate change. It's not just because it's a danger to me, but the planet is actually something that exists as a gift from God in itself and for us. And I think Pope Francis has, as an earlier scientist himself, seems to have recognized this much earlier than maybe other church leaders, also because there have been so many problems, social, political, across the globe. And since we are a global church, then these ideas are brought to the fore maybe faster than in some other denominations, for example. So the Synod on the Amazon a few years ago really highlighted the plight of the socioeconomic factors, the land grabs, the destruction of the rainforests, and all of those questions, and especially with people from the Amazon themselves coming to Rome to speak about it, I think highlighted for some of us who are a little bit more comfortable in North America, say, but we could really feel the impact of how this is really affecting people face to face, so to speak, and not just reading about it.
You know,
Maggie, there are a few.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say there are actually a few Christians. Catherine Hayhoe is an evangelical Christian from the United States who's done all kinds of work on this. Yeah. And of course, it'd be remiss if there's an organization called Arosha, which is a Christian Protestant organization that's been doing really, really great on the ground education about not just climate change per se writ large, but also learning to love your local context. And I think increasingly it's the people who are actually learning to love those local things that actually help us fix the broader agenda. Because you really do see in the climate change conversation, there's misanthropy, those who say we should just get rid of human beings. And I think that there are really strong resources that the Christian community can offer to those who are concerned about the environment that frankly are missing. And I think there's a lot to offer there. And if you look for it, you can find it.
Absolutely. And Catherine Hayhoe is a friend to Context. So she's doing amazing work. We have 30 seconds left, Jackie, and I want to ask you, we've been talking a lot about climate change and poverty in this show. Tell me what climate change looks like for you in Kenya, as you're in a country that probably is seeing the effects of this every day.
Absolutely. There's no denying that climate change is real. And I find it quite sad that many people, including Christians, actually don't believe it. I came across a recent study that said 30% of evangelical Christians in the US are concerned about climate change, and 40% believe there is no scientific basis for climate change, which I find shocking, because come to Africa, come to Kenya, ask anyone, and they will talk to you about climate change. They may not use that same exact term, but they will tell you how the weather is changing, how the soil is changing. And we can see these patterns, and it's only getting worse year after year. There are so many organizations that are working on the ground and foundations who are funding climate resiliency projects. This is now becoming a huge expanding area in the philanthropic sector, because it is such an emergency in places like this, where vulnerable people who are already struggling are just pushed to the margins even more because of this climate crisis. And we really need to take action, because we're just seeing it unfold every single day, and it is not good.
Yeah. Emergency, crisis. These are words that we need to use in the same vein as climate change in order for it to really sink in. Thank you so much, Jackie, Brian, and Moira, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
God made the earth and he said, "It is good." He left it in our care, and now we face so many dangerous realities. We watch as roads, homes, and livelihoods washed away in BC, just months after parts of that same province lost much to wildfires. The realities of climate change are ravaging the world we were left to steward, the land we were left to cultivate, the animals we were left to care for. Children are being sold in order for families to eat. Rivers are drying up, leaving many parched. Would God look at the earth now and say, "It is good"? It's a question we must all ask ourselves. Thank you for watching. Let us know what you think of today's topic. Join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. For all of us here, I'm Maggie John. See you next time.
Thank you for your ongoing support of Crossroads, a supporter-funded nonprofit organization and member of the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. Thanks to faithful people like you, we are able to continue producing Context. You can write to Crossroads, P.O. Box 5100, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 4M2, or visit crossroads.ca to learn more about our programs.
Context Beyond the Headlines invites you to an exciting new season. This year, we're expanding our reach with a brand new podcast that will explore the interaction between faith, justice, culture, ethics, and society. As we move forward with this brand new season and the launch of this brand new podcast, would you consider partnering with Context financially? It is because of the generosity of viewers like you that we're able to continue to tell the stories that matter.